Hey everyone, we have a pretty unique episode of the Weaviate podcast. Today we welcome Floris Hoogenboom, who's built this website using Weaviate that organizes information about the Dutch elections. So you ask it questions like, say, highway construction, and it uses the semantic search technology with additional filters across the different parties. And overall, this is a super interesting technology. And in the podcast, we're going to discuss all things from the technical details of how this is constructed, the use of Weaviate, semantic search, embeddings, as well as technology like summarization with ChatGPT and multilingual, processing Dutch text. So I really hope you enjoy the podcast. We also conclude with some discussions around bias, especially important for applications like this. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I really hope you check out the website, especially if you're in the Netherlands. Thanks so much for watching. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching another episode of the Weaviate podcast. I'm super excited to welcome Floris to the podcast. Floris is building something super interesting with Weaviate and a pretty novel application of Weaviate. So Floris, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, nice to be here, Connor. Love it.
Awesome. So can you dive right into it and tell us about your project with Weaviate?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that already was on my mind and a few other open source fanatics with me for a couple of years of doing something around parliamentary elections and data or AI. Usually every year we had that idea a month before the election started, and we thought, "Damn it, again too late." But this time we were in time, and what we have been working on is basically a tool that allows users to explore party manifestos of the political parties in the Dutch parliamentary elections. And we do that basically in sort of two stage. First of all, we allow them to explore, so find out what's in there. But I don't know about you. Did you ever read party manifestos? Yeah, in the US it's a bit different, but it's a lot of text, eh?
No, me personally, no.
Okay.
I see the importance of the application,
Same
though.
for me, and I'm even quite politically engaged in that sense, because it's just too much text and too much text to make sense of. So what we do on top of that is not only allow searching for those party manifestos, but also allow summarization. Okay, you type in a statement. I think that the Netherlands should invest more in artificial intelligence. Of course, I do. And it will give you a summary of what each party thinks about that statement you just entered.
Yeah, that's super cool. The use of the summary thing is so interesting as well. And so I'm very curious about just the kind of maybe we could start with the technical requirements, like the kind of developer experience of getting the data into Weaviate and like kind of what your experience with that part of it was.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I met Bob from my daytime profession basically a couple of years ago. I think way before the investment that you guys had. And it was always on my mind. I want to do something with this software, and for me, it really started during Christmas, playing around with it a bit, exploring the API, and basically it was pretty smooth actually. Getting it up and running with the Docker files or the Docker Compose setup you guys provided. And basically from that just build out this idea, and once we get to a point where we thought, hey, this is gonna work, I reached out to Bob like, hey, can we do a collaboration on this, because this is cool, this is helping democracy, this is AI for good basically. And then we switched to the Weaviate cloud service, and it was actually a pretty smooth process. From a developer perspective, it was pretty hands off. We started locally. We had a nice local setup, and once we had the Weaviate cloud service, our production setup basically was just it was just changing URLs and tokens basically.
Super amazing. Something else I'm really curious with this application is like, how do you feel about the performance of the embedding models? Like when you're doing, how are you evaluating the quality of the search? What does that kind of thing look like?
So it is of course a tricky topic to apply AI in, and we have banners all over the website indicating, hey, this might be wrong, and this is not intended as an advice for you guys to where what you should vote. It's only intended to show, hey, AI in the future might also play a role in this. So we're not trying to replace any parties you have in the Netherlands, for example, like Kieskompas. That's basically a site which preps statements, then allows you to answer to answer your own position on the statement and gives you an advice. For us, it's really about showing what AI can do. If you look at the embeddings, we think the quality is quite good. We noticed a few things. We're doing this in Dutch, so most of the corpus isn't trained on Dutch language, of course. Still works out pretty decent. Abbreviations, etc. That's where it becomes a bit difficult. But what we also did is we ask users to help us a bit. And what we do in that sense is when you enter a statement, we find the 3 nearest paragraphs in vector space, and then we ask you as a user, hey, we think your answer might be in one of those in one of those chapters. Which one do you think matches best? And with that 2-stage approach, we've been able to get pretty decent results there.
So is that 2-stage approach like maybe because we've been thinking about this idea around like Weaviate and this other technology called GPT Index, where they have like a hierarchical summary. So are you first searching through a summary of? So I imagine these are these long statements of party preferences, and so you first have these summaries, and then which summary you like, that takes you then into the document where you then find a more fine grain particular to the party. Is that a correct understanding, or?
No, it's way simpler than that in that sense. So we just index the sections of so each paragraph of the party manifestos. That's also where we evaluate embeddings on. So your short statement, the embedding of that, and the paragraph. But what we do is we don't return a single result and then say, hey, this is it. But we prompt the user, okay, we found 3 results. Because if you look at these party manifestos, if they talk about, for example, trade agreements, that might be about trade agreements within the European Union, that might be about trade agreements with the US, that might be about the Brexit. So there's a lot of nuance there. And that's why we thought, okay, we won't return a single answer, but rather we return the 3 most relevant chapters and then let the user figure out, okay, based on the title of that chapter, I think that this is the one which will answer my statement. And that also means we have the user help the system a bit to figure out the right answer.
Very cool. So it's like the user interface is designed in a way to collect the data, and so I guess I was a little confused on kind of the understanding the 2-stage process of that. So once you click it, it then takes you into the full article, so sort of like a web URL in a way.
Yeah. So what happens is you enter your statement. Then you say, okay, I wanna know what this party. So take, for example, the Democratic Party in the Netherlands. What does it think about this statement? Then we'll give you 3 options. We'll select a chapter, and from that it takes you into the full text that we indexed of that chapter, with references to where you can find it on the party's website. And on top of that, we offer you the option then to use a sort of ChatGPT-like model to summarize, okay, what does this piece of text say about my statement?
Super cool. Yeah, so that data from the first search query and then 3 results, do you use that data to then compare models with each other? Or I'm just curious if that kind of part of it interests you.
At the moment we don't, and that's just purely because of lack of time, because we have all kinds of interesting ideas also what you can do, of course, with this, especially also those statements that we collect. That's super interesting information to know, hey, what's going on in society, basically which themes people find interesting. So we collect statistics about each statement, how often it has been searched. There we also use Weaviate, of course, because it's free text entry. And if you search for the Netherlands should leave Europe, or the Netherlands should leave the European Union, you probably mean the same, although the former is factual impossible. But we then try to do some analytics on that by merging similar statements together. See, hey, which are the themes that pop up? Which are the themes that people find interesting? What are the parties that people are interested for in those teams? So that is basically also the follow up that we'll give to this after the election. Not only helping people figure or scroll through those programs a bit more, but also get some insight into, hey, what's going on? Which are the big themes actually that people find interesting?
Yeah, it's amazing. It reminded me of another Dutch scientist who came on the podcast was Martin Grutendorst, and I hope I've got that last name right. And he has this tool called BERT Topic that I think is super interesting with what you're just describing, where what you do is you cluster all the statements in the vector space, and then you have the vector clusters, and then you do TF-IDF on the clusters to have the unique keywords to each of the clusters. So it would be like, I don't want to start getting into the political topics, like the different. Yeah, so it's a super interesting way of discovery. So another question with respect to Weaviate that I was really curious to ask you about was the use of the symbolic filters. So, like, as maybe to set this up, like I've been playing around with this podcast search project. So, like with our conversation right now, I'm going to embed the transcript and put it in, like, search to it, and you can have symbolic filters like, where speaker equals. Martin Grutendorst, and then I ask my question with that symbolic filter. So how are you thinking about, like, kind of the extra metadata that goes around the text and that kind of thinking?
I think for us that's super important. So what we do is we store all paragraphs basically in one big index, but we also store that with the information like, okay, which party said that? What is the chapter? The chapter here, and we're thinking in the future maybe we want to enhance our search by also adding some common themes, like, hey, this is sort of keywords that we see there. But what we do is if you retrieve information from a single party, we do use those filters to only do the filter before search, basically. I think you guys call it. And we first filter, okay, which the party that we're interested in, and subsequently we then use the embedding index, the vector index, basically to figure out, okay, which paragraphs of this party are interesting. So that does limit us in, for example, we can't yet use the hybrid search, which combines sparse and dense vector search, which would be, I think, an enormous performance improvement for a lot of the things, because a lot of keywords that probably now aren't in the vocabulary of our embeddings, or aren't that common in that sense. Like in Dutch, you got an abbreviation. It's called AOW, which is for pension, basically. And it is something, if you search on it and you do the embedding, just purely dense comparison, you probably won't find it, because it's so rare in that corpus that those embeddings don't really pick it up. So we're still hoping that at a certain point we might be able to use the hybrid search, or with the dense search combined with filters, because we think that will enable us to give way more relevant results than we're already doing now, and maybe even get rid of that two-stage approach, having users select their own paragraph there.
Yeah, that's super cool. That idea of, like, the thinking around how do you add the AOW token to a dense embedding model, I find to be very interesting. Like, whether you can just kind of add a new token to the vocabulary and just do a little bit of fine tuning on these, on these texts, and whether that can correct it. But yeah, the hybrid search adding the where filters, the Weaviate 118 feature that I hope people are interested in.
Looking forward.
So one other question I wanted to ask about, and I've been thinking a lot about the role of, like, potentially cross-encoder re-ranking in Weaviate, where basically you search and then you have this high-capacity scoring model that re-ranks the results. But the trade-off is sort of speed, and I'm curious, like, with your application, how important do you think speed is to the user experience of search?
I I tend to say super important, but I think for our application, the bottleneck also isn't isn't Weaviate. Because if you look at the size of our index, it's pretty small. Like the average party manifesto is, I think, 200 pages, embedding that in paragraphs. So I think that if we have like 5,000 objects in that vector space, then it's already a lot in that sense. So the bottleneck for us is really computing those embeddings. I haven't tried Weaviate on a larger section. As something that we're now thinking about is what would be really cool is if you can use this technology on not transcripts of this podcast. That would also be pretty cool, Connor, but on transcripts of what happens in Parliament. What does your elected representative really say in Parliament after he's elected about the themes that are important? And I think that is something where I even feel that if you talk about AI for good, AI helping democracy, that I would love to see where this is going, and then also explore how that index grows, because that's way more data than we're processing now, because that takes out the role of colored media basically, and really makes it factual. Okay, what was said about this team? Not how did we frame it in the media, but what was said about it. And I think that is an interesting role where this technology can help really for making democracy more transparent in that sense.
Yeah, it's a super impactful application, I think, and yeah, sort of this truthful thing inspired me to start thinking a little bit more about the idea of the ChatGPT summarization. And there's kind of this idea of like adding prompts that say, "Please cite your sources" or something like that. So when you've come into the text and now you're using the summarization model, how do you think about then citing the sources with the summary that's produced?
Yeah. So it's something we've been debating a lot, whether we want that ChatGPT summary in there, or we would say, well, we now just stick with finding the right paragraph, because that's factual, and that ChatGPT is something that can go berserk, that can hallucinate a bit. We opted for doing it mainly because our goal now is not to have the most factual platform, but rather to showcase, hey, at this moment the technology is not there, but this is what AI will be doing for you in the future. So that's also how we communicate about this. We'll never say we have 100% the right answer. Everything is filled with banners. Hey, this might be wrong. If you really want the true answer, look at the paragraph, read it. But it is something that we also put a lot of effort into in figuring out, okay, what kind of prompt do we ask ChatGPT there? And something that we found out that works really nicely. I think you've seen those examples of ChatGPT going wrong. Like, okay, what is with those riddles, basically. Bob's brother's called blah blah blah, and his mother is this, and then ChatGPT confidently giving the wrong answer. But what is interesting, if you ask ChatGPT not to give you the answer, but to give you the reasoning, why will you come up with those answers? You generally get better results. So that prompt engineering, where we ask ChatGPT, hey, what does this source think about this statement? And please cite the sentences that made you come to these conclusions. And if there aren't any relevant sentences, indicate that you can't give the answer. That kind of prompts helped us to get this to a level where at least we think, okay, it's good enough for this demo. This is not hard science, comparing this, but in our tests, out of 100 statements, we had one where we thought, hey, this might not be the proper result there. So not there yet, but interesting to showcase.
There's a couple of things maybe quickly on the idea of the prompting. One of the examples, Erica recently published a LangChain Weaviate demo. And one of the first examples was this, it answers a question and then you follow up by taking the answer as input and saying, what were the assumptions you made when answering this question? And then like that is the input to, based on these assumptions, do you still agree with this answer? And this kind of chaining and the ability of that particular way to reduce hallucination is really interesting. But then you ended with saying something that really got my interest. So you're looking at the summaries from ChatGPT and annotating. Is this a hallucination?
Yeah, and we don't do this large scale, but we thought before we feel confidently enough to put this out in the open. Basically, we want to have an idea of the quality. So what we did, we prepped a set of around 50 statements, got the results from the whole chain. What would be the output of that summary, and then labeled that. Hey, do we think this is okay, or do we think this is completely off? But once again, that's really a qualitative answer to a very difficult question, I think.
Yeah, they have these kind of like quantitative abstractive summarization metrics like the rouge score or blue score. They're basically like n-gram overlap metrics compared to some ground truth summary of the thing. So let's say you're summarizing like a scientific paper, you could use like the abstract as kind of like that ground truth and compare these metrics. Is there any kind of like ground truth summary from one of these statements and then I guess that would be one question, but maybe the bigger question is from your use case perspective, would those metrics be interesting to you as a way to kind of ablate the prompts, ablate the chains, ablate like the way that it's doing the summary?
Yeah, I don't know enough about those metrics to really judge that. I need to admit. But what would be very interesting for us, and that's also something that we will be looking at into the future. Like I said, we have those election aids basically, which are tools that had people read through all those programs, then position parties on a set of statements. Do they agree with it? Do they partially agree with it? Do they disagree with this? And they do that in a really scientific manner, which is a sort of peer reviewed. The parties themselves review it, and there's a lot of trust building that goes into that. What would be very interesting, of course, also once this technology progresses, to seek a sort of a hybrid form between that, so where we've put a lot of effort into placing those parties, knowing what they think, knowing what the conclusion should be, and this more open-ended. Okay, what do we generate as those conclusions? So that might be something for in Europe. We have the European elections coming up next year. Which is, by the way, a very interesting case because they're still debating whether you can also vote for parties from other European countries. And why that's interesting, because then also the language aspect comes into play, of course. But that might be something where at a certain point we hope that technology might have evolved then, and where we can try things like this out a bit more.
Yeah, the language jump is something that I think is an extremely emerging topic of this technology. Like for example, we've been working with Cohere's multilingual embedding models, and these are like really good embeddings for multilingual. And so I'm curious. Well, maybe staying on the summarization thing, do you like Hugging Face had this model called Bloom, which was like a multilingual language model, and I'm just curious if maybe in addition to ChatGPT, if you've tried some of these other large language models that maybe have been trained on Dutch and are then better at it.
No, not yet. And that would be really something that if we would go that route of that European elections by that time, that would of course be very interesting to explore, because there you get party manifestos that might be in French, but a German citizen can vote for a French party, but I'm pretty sure he wants to know before he casts his vote on what's in that manifesto then. So then you're not only getting Dutch results in that sense, but you're searching for a statement in Dutch or in German maybe. You're getting a result in French, and then summarizing it again towards German or Dutch or whatever. So I'm not sure about whether I would dare that with the current quality, but it is an interesting chain of thought, basically, how this can also help, make make a lot of sources that aren't in your native language searchable and easier to explore, basically.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And when I was talking to Nils Reimers from Cohere about this, he had mentioned that like one approach would be like you take the German and French and you translate it back to English, and then you kind of can just have it all in English where like the model has, you know. But then he described that there are these things like that then you get a very like U.S. centric view of the world. Like if you translate how do I do my taxes in Germany back to English, it like doesn't really work like that. So, would you think about fine tuning one of these language models on your text? Is another idea. Yeah.
Yeah, it is something we now thought about of for these embeddings. We didn't do that because sheer lack of time and resources, basically.
Mm,
Um, 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 but I'm not sure how that would work with translations, basically. Yeah, because I think that's where the big challenge is. If you read political text, it's all about nuances. It's
mm,
not about the general theme, but it's about the tone of voice in certain. And I think factual translation is one, but also translating these things like, okay, how does this sound? How does this feel? Which are pretty important actually for getting the meaning of something. Eh? Um, yeah, I'm not sure if the technology will be there yet. And if you would then do fine tuning, then you need to have a translated party manifesto there, where you also want probably have that reviewed. Eh? So I think that would be a lot of effort, basically. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying it will not be done in the future, but I don't think it's we're there yet.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you bring up on like embeddings can capture different kinds of relationships. So like the factual relationship or the tone relationship. I'm thinking about this a lot as well. There are these papers that are coming out like task aware retrieval with instructions and instructor where basically the embeddings it like depends on they like add intent. It's almost like prompting for embeddings as well where you say like if you're searching for Stack Overflow, like you might say I'm searching for another question compared to I'm searching for the answer directly. But yeah, this kind of like embeddings being able to capture different kinds of meanings. But I guess I was actually curious about the idea of fine tuning the language model rather than the embeddings. Like because I think with the summarization or like just the idea of continuing the language modeling on the Dutch text, would that kind of thing sound like something that would be useful for this case? Like I'm thinking about trying to improve that summarization model.
Yeah, it might be. It is something we thought about. Again, didn't do it yet, but if somebody's listening who's happy to contribute, we're still looking for a lot of volunteers to help this thing out. Um, yeah, I'm thinking about it. What it would do with basically doesn't it get too colored in that sense? And it also it depends, I think, on how you train that, what kind of
Mhm.
um, um, and if you look at those party manifestos, they all have a very different tone in that sense. But
Mm.
also the corpus isn't that large. So I'm really curious. Okay, will you get a sort of average political tone from that? And what that would do with the readability of your summaries? Will they be very politically like long
Mm.
sentences, hard to read? Because what I like now and what I think is the strength of this is that it also translates it to a pretty neutral language. And
Mm.
I'm curious, will you keep that neutral language? If you would fine tune, and it depends on the extent to which you fine tune it. But if you would fine tune based on um, these manifestos. Maybe if you would fine tune it based on manifestos and media coverage of the elections, etc. I think that would be a more interesting concept to me. Like also take newspaper articles, take what's written online, take transcripts
Mm.
of debates, etc. If you collect a corpus like that, I think this might work.
Hmm. Yeah, so that it's really inspired me to think about the whole like because the role of bias in language models is something that's brought up a lot, and this application particularly seems pretty important for that. And yeah, I almost think like maybe the user interface, like you type in the question, and then it should have like I don't know, the view is like statement from each of the parties rather than like just like a ranked list, how we're used to seeing search results. But yeah, how do you think about that kind of bias in this problem?
Yeah, I think it is a huge issue. I don't think we have any idea to which extent that issue is here. So I think that's one of the big factors why I also everywhere I talk about this, whether it's on tomorrow will be on national radio basically, and um, uh, everywhere I say this is not intended as election advice. This is intended to showcase what the technology
Mm,
can do and will be able to do. And in the future, it might be a bit of advice. We thought about collecting user feedback there, huh? On okay, how does this summary sound to you?
mm,
Do you think this summary agrees with the view of the party that is stated here?
mm,
But we were a bit afraid for basically data pollution there of people who enter a statement, look it up for the party they will never vote on, and then click no, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, not answering the question that was there, but rather expressing their political
yeah.
opinion there. So we didn't do that, but it would be really interesting to also have this in a sort of controlled setting where um, we really have guidelines on okay, how do we label these things, eh? And how do we identify bias? But that is something that takes a way more, or it takes a way different expertise, I think, than only the tech expertise we have here, but that
Hmm.
also requires expertise from political sciences, or, for example, a collaboration like I just mentioned with one of those election aides in the Netherlands that have a whole process of getting from these manifestos to positions on statements. But it's really interesting to think about this going forward.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean the role of I mean it. Yeah, I really have too. I don't have too much expertise on bias in the whole thing, but yeah, it's like there's obviously this amazing technology of we can now semantically search through all the everything written, every conversation, all that, and then there's like is the search embeddings or the language model like biased towards one political view, and therefore it's going to kind of only match the results that match the underlying model. And I think like kind of the auditing tools that people like you who are building these applications, I think all that will be really important. So yeah, cool. I mean, but it is super exciting.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also on how you define bias, eh? Because I
Yeah.
sometimes have these discussions professionally, like uh, bias-free ML. But basically, the reason why certain ML works is because it's biased. Only it's biased on attributes we
Mm.
think it's okay to be biased on. It's biased on a certain feature that gives it the power. So it's also a whole discussion like, okay, what do we find acceptable there? Eh? And if this, for example, would be have the same bias as any newspaper, because I'm not advocating here against all media, absolutely not. But every news outlet, of course, has some form of bias in it, sometimes more profound than other times. Um, um, but that's something we generally think is okay, or at least in certain parts of society agree on that is a sort of the representation of the truth. So it's really interesting to think about, okay, um, how does bias affect this, and when is that an issue in that sense? But that's a more societal discussion, I think, than it is a technological one, to be honest.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's like a hand in hand thing. I think from the technology perspective, I can maybe speak a little bit about in machine learning. There's this problem called class imbalance, where just from the basic classifier sense, if you're classifying cats and dogs, and your data set is 80% dogs and 20% cats, it's gonna be really biased at predicting dogs, and that's like, and that it's especially a problem with like medical patient outcome prediction, where it's like usually the patient survives, but like sometimes they expire in the window, and then you have this like bias. So you use like precision recall, F score metrics, things like that. But so like even in the contrastive learning, embedding learning, if most of the texts have this one political view, it's more likely to match the query and the optimization objective, and therefore it's less likely to, like, if you have this like radical new idea, it's less likely to match that just because it's less likely in the training set. Just from the technical perspective, that's how I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's an interesting topic, and it's a topic that I don't think we fully covered yet. That as a tech community, but also as a society. What do we find acceptable? And I always make the example also of um, if people professionally talk to me about bias in ML, then I also always refer to the Dutch pension scheme, where everybody pays a certain the same amount, and from a fixed age you get the same pension. But I pay the same amount as women. I'm not advocating that we should do this differently, but just to illustrate how difficult it is. Although women have a longer life expectancy of around 3 years, so you might say, well, it's if you talk about fairness, yeah, is it fair that men statistically live shorter, but hence relatively pay more for their pension scheme? And I think this is something where we as society say, nah, that's not an issue. And if probably people will be laughing at me now for bringing this up, but it's really about what do you define as bias and what do you accept as bias and unfairness, etc. in your algorithms, rather than it is a technical discussion like how do we make our features orthogonal, or how do we make, yeah, that's a means to an end, but that still then is okay, what do I accept as things where it can be biased.
Yeah, it's such an interesting application of the technology. I can see, like, like if we say like the extractive question answering models that classify the answer within the context, that has a low risk of bias, I think, because it's kind of like grounded in it. Whereas like the ChatGPT to like summarize or like chat with you based, like the one application is you turn chat, obviously it is a chatbot to begin with, and you retrieve to have it supplement its context as you chat with it. And it might probably, like, the political bias of ChatGPT might come into play as it's reading that retrieved context and telling and speaking with you. So I imagine that, as well as I imagine just kind of search results in general, sort of. Yeah, I kind of like that idea of the user interface that takes you to each of the views rather than just like a ranked list. Just thinking about it for the first time, but like that kind of way. And yeah, so Floris, is super interesting speaking with you. You're working on a super interesting problem, and it's such an exciting application of the technology. So thank you so much for joining the podcast and for discussing these ideas with me.
Yeah, cool. Glad to be here, and nice talking, Connor.